Hey everybody, my name is Brian Holstrom and I currently teach AP World History courses in Tucson, Arizona. Today I'm hoping to offer a rationale for why our history courses continue to contribute to societal short-sightedness on climate change and environmental degradation. I want to share an explanation for cultural apathy towards environmental history and to suggest the value of world history as a vehicle for examining ecological and environmental change over time. Teaching world history with limitless scope and interdisciplinarity has often caused me to ask myself, what am I doing and why? My first memory of grappling with this existential crisis came as a rookie teacher at South Point Catholic High School here in Tucson. I asked our leading world history teacher, a Catholic priest, stalwart, and a heck of a storyteller, how he organized his course, especially his periodization. Where do you start? I was expecting Paleolithic humans or the Neolithic Revolution. I start with Rome, he replied. And I came to find out that nearly the entire first semester of a so-called world history course would be Roman history. When I circled back to inquire about his exams, I found out there were giant matching sections of Roman emperors and key dates that students were expected to memorize. It made me distraught that world history at that time still meant Western civilization, with a dash of other parts of the planet when they might be relevant to the West. So since that time, I've constantly grappled with this challenge of having limited, precious time with students and having to make powerful choices in carving up the whole world and all of history in a way that would be digestible and nourishing for my students' education. So in selecting content, I've settled on the idea that history should engage students with contextualizing and evaluating who we are as humans, how we relate to one another, and increasingly, how we relate to the natural environment. In a world of accelerating rates of environmental degradation and climate change, my current crisis lies in believing that I have been failed and that I continue to fail my students in this third objective, passing on historical narratives that are apathetic or even averse to environmental consciousness. As an example, most world history courses engage students in the first river civilizations, but nature exists only as either a resource or an obstacle, with little regard for the ecological impacts of humans choosing where the water goes and where it does not go. What plants thrive and multiply, what animals become our sources of labor, and what animal species we destroy or consume. Briefly shifting to the modern day, consider water usage in this region today. For millennia, humans adapted to the natural flow of the Nile. Now humans largely orchestrate it. The Aswan Dam and subsequent creation of Lake Nasser has meant humans increasingly dictate how much water and where and when it flows. The Suez Canal forcibly connects the ecosystems of the Mediterranean and the Red Seas. Transportation for sure, but also the potential migration and competition between species of plants and animals from the Indian Ocean all the way to the Strait of Gibraltar. Species that were once separated by thousands of miles and millions of years of evolutionary development are suddenly thrust upon one another, with humans largely arbitrating the ultimate winners and losers based on their utility or threat to humanity. Our courses stress human development, either villainizing nature as an obstacle or commodifying the environment as a resource. There's rarely any illustrative examples of sustainable use or preservation of nature. I believe the history courses we teach, which are the narratives that form and affirm our identities, continue to cultivate a society that remains short-sighted regarding climate change and the ecological impacts of our species. I developed an explanation for this problem after reading a paper by behavioral scientists that found biases in psychological studies that primarily studied people from Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic societies. Weird. And then they projected their findings as universal to all human beings. I believe our world history courses are also biased by similar cultural lenses through which we examine the past, and I believe each of these biases compounds the neglect of environmental history, or amplifies the perception of environmentally conscious history as countercultural or history for hippies. These biases may be especially powerful in the United States, Europe, the West, but also have been spread globally via colonization, industrialization, and globalization patterns over the last 500 years. World history has certainly grown more global in scope, but I argue these weird biases still shape a lot of our curriculum development and instruction. I'm going to provide a brief overview of each of these biases and suggest how they detract from our awareness and inclusion of the environment in world history courses. Then I'm going to examine how world history itself offers an escape from the gravity of weird biases and an opportunity for ecology and environmental agency in history. So the values of Western civilization tend to idolize humanity and diminish the role of the environment in historical narratives of human affairs. Ancient Greek culture emphasized arete, meaning human excellence and fulfillment, as well as the worship of immortal but very human gods and goddesses. The works of Greek philosophers and scholars, including historians like Herodotus and Thucydides, established humanist traditions that stressed anthropocentric narratives. As Hellenistic and Roman periods of imperialism spread these values throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond, worshiping humanity became the ideological backbone for the largest empires in the West. Faith in human reason and agency were preserved and enhanced by Muslim scholars and Christian scholastic movements, and were reborn and rebranded humanism with a Christian framework in Renaissance Europe. A syncretic blend of humanism with Abrahamic views of a fatherly God who created man in his image and promised his creation for human stewardship put humans at the center of all existence and spawned subsequent philosophic movements that put a premium on human ingenuity to master the environment and transform wilderness into civilization. Abrahamic faiths also aggressively displaced animistic and polytheistic religious traditions, which once prioritized spirits of nature and ecological processes. There are clear counterexamples of environmentalism in Judeo-Christian and Islamic traditions, like St. Francis and the current pope that bears the same name. But I would argue that humanism and Abrahamic faiths have historically contributed to anthropocentric narratives at the expense of environmental awareness. Idolizing humans pairs well with my next two Western cultural lenses affecting our view of the world and our aversion to environmental history. Capitalism and classical liberalism in Western culture prioritize individual success through free market competition rather than collective ecological harmony. These ideologies encourage unrestricted extraction of natural resources and commercialization patterns, resulting in ever-accelerating environmental exploitation. Environmental historian Donald Worster offers three maxims for the ecological values taught by the capitalist ethos. One, that nature is capital, that man has a right, even an obligation, to use this capital for self-advancement, and that the social order should permit and encourage this continual accumulation of personal wealth. Our course narratives stress development and competition, often depicting modern world history as a race by various nation states for economic and political supremacy in their patterns of production and consumption. Ecological sustainability or the rights of nature are ignored or deemed heretical. Speaking of nation states, history has routinely been formed and financed in the processes of affirming cultural identities and legitimizing the political rule of kingdoms, nations, and empires. I share a photo of Mount Rushmore, a mountain formed into a historical monument to selected US presidents. Debates are raging regarding which humans ought to be so memorialized, but this photo has me wondering about the whole premise of clearing space on such a scale for worshiping any humans or nations. Global transnational history is a relatively new endeavor, and there continues to exist plenty of cultural resistance to globalized history. Students in world history courses today are heavily exposed to the creation of states and imperial processes of conquest. Political, economic, and social relationships are emphasized, but when the environment is included in these traditional historical narratives, it's often only as a resource for exploitation or an obstacle to be outmaneuvered. As it intensified during the 19th and 20th centuries through revolutions, independence movements, and global conflicts, nationalism ensured competitive nations would prioritize industrial growth and economic strength, as well as patriotic historical narratives that would legitimize their ascent. In this same vein, our world history textbooks and curricula tend to focus on the accelerating emergence of Western industrialized nation states, rather than their accelerating patterns of environmental exploitation. For the past few centuries, the key to political and economic power has been industrialization and technological development. Industrial processes and expanding use of fossil fuel energies resulted in exploding rates of productivity and consumption, empowering the wealthiest states and cultures, but also causing skyrocketing rates of environmental exploitation and degradation. Industrialization and mechanization continue to displace rural agricultural jobs, resulting in traumatic rates of urbanization. In today's world, more than half of all humans live in cities and are increasingly disconnected from nature in their occupations and activities. Modern sanitation and health technologies have made this more than suitable for humans, but concentrated urban populations increase the strain on global ecologies. Contributing to our ignorance or apathy, the modern city disguises humankind's dysfunctional relationship with nature, preserving small samples of the natural environment in the form of parks, zoos, and green spaces, while further separating the city dweller from the waste and pollution one produces. The traffic of people and products proceed in view of all. The rivers of sewage and trash are concealed, creating a mirage of sustainability. As a suburbanite, I do not directly witness ecological costs of my diet or my consumption. The modern dominance of westernized, rich industrial states has resulted in what environmental historian J. Donald Hughes describes as a contemporary culture adapted to abundant resources, fossil fuel energy, and rapid economic growth, patterns that will not easily be altered should circumstances change. And the behavior of human economy in the 20th century has increased the inevitability of change. In these states, which are also largely democratic, culture directly dictates policymaking in politics, economics, and education. In garnering the popular vote, political parties, campaign finance, and corporate interests control political power and policymaking in these weird democratic nation states. This policymaking includes public education systems created on national and local levels. We should not be surprised that curricula and textbook selection for history courses bends towards the affirmation of the cultural norms of its creators and intended audience. Regarding political, economic, and social history, political parties are quick to assert which history should be required and taught. An ongoing illustration of the politicization of history in the United States is the clamor over the 1619 Project to give greater historical focus to the role of slavery in the rise of the United States, and the Trump administration's creation of the 1776 Commission to restore patriotic history. State curricula, standards of instruction, and textbook selections are made by panels appointed by party-affiliated governors and legislators, and the content that informs both teachers and students identity affirming. Lobbyists and corporate financing also make a clear impact on the development of educational programs. Funding from Koch Industries presents a high-profile example affecting the inclusion of environmental history into mainstream classrooms in the United States. As a major stakeholder in fossil fuels, the group invests in nationwide programs like the Bill of Rights Institute, which advocates for libertarian capitalist perspectives in social studies instruction, yet avoids any critical discussion of ecological issues like climate change and environmental degradation. So in a democratic system, racing to win the next election with what is immediately popular and profitable, what weird biases would lobby for environmental awareness in politically selected history's identity-affirming feedback loop? If we are teaching weird wired history, we are likely contributing to apathy for or even aversion to agency and value of nature. Environmental history remains largely shut out of the humanities and suffers from three major criticisms. First, environmental determinism, the idea that the fate of humans might depend more on nature than we allow ourselves to believe. This constitutes a major threat to Western ideologies of human supremacy that puts the W in weird. A second cause for criticism is the likelihood that environmentally conscious narratives of history will be declensionist tales of tragedy. Weird wired history typically narrates a series of human-initiated developments that ultimately produce us and our current dominance. If we looked at history and focus on, say, biodiversity or environmental change and degradation, and entertain the idea that we are now in the Anthropocene, a geologic age during which human processes have become the most powerful force for ecological change on the planet, the trajectory of our narratives might have an unsavory trajectory indeed. I will now allow an office full of chimpanzees who are celebrating their manipulated sales data to illustrate our disdain for narratives that suggest decline.
Just thought you might want to know, sales aren't up, they're down.
So if we don't like sad stories, we shouldn't be surprised that our narratives of history, especially when intended for younger audiences, avoid topics and trajectories that might be upsetting, even traumatic. When are students ready to be engaged with the full extent of human brutality towards each other and also towards nature? A third criticism often hurled towards the inclusion of environmental history is that it is inevitably tied towards advocacy or political activism. I would counter that all history is, in its own way, activism, an activation of memory and attention. In choosing to remember, record, narrate, and teach history, we reveal and advance our priorities and our ideals. When history confirms the prevailing cultural norms, it's readily accepted as scholarship. When it suggests current trajectories are unsustainable or declensionist, it is vulnerable to dismissal as advocacy or activism. The same threat faces all Minority Report histories, but history with environmental perspectives may suffer this fate the most. Swimming against the current of this feedback loop requires ambition and often courage. While our weird cultural lenses normalize the world's current conditions, historian John R. McNeill argues, in fact, in ecological terms, the current situation is an extreme deviation from any of the durable, more normal states of the world over the span of human history, indeed over the span of Earth history. For creatures who live a mere 70 years or so, the study of the past, distant and recent, is required to know what a range of possibilities includes and to know what might endure. If I had to choose one book which has inspired and informed my new directions, it would be McNeill's Something New Under the Sun. For here lies my newest passion for teaching world history, escaping the gravity of weird biases in teaching what it means to be human, how we relate to each other, and, with increasing emphasis, how we interact with nature. In advocating for the growth of our field, Jerry Bentley once suggested world history could align with movements seeking to advance the causes of global citizenship, cosmopolitan democracy, cross-cultural dialogue, and related projects. He argued world history would be a, quote, major step forward from xenophobic and hyper-patriotic versions of the global past that are all too prominent. A timely addition to Bentley's list of global projects must be confronting environmental degradation and ecological change. I do not witness deforestation and climate change from the view of my window in my suburban home, but world history that transcends time and space allows me to engage my students in the complexities of human relations with the environment. I've begun repacking my courses with new vision, eager to find opportunities to introduce students to ecological changes like deforestation, desertification, salinization, soil erosion, biodiversity, and migrating species, all while still emphasizing the existence of perhaps the most invasive mammal species of all, us. I'm also desperately seeking examples of successful preservation of nature and sustainable use by humans. The curriculum for the course I currently teach, honestly, doesn't offer me much, and I use this as an example of unrealized potential across many world history curricula that informs teacher instruction and assessment. I charted the themes of this course and is encouraging that humans and the environment is the #1 theme. This theme does elicit examining how, quote, the environment shapes human societies, and as populations grow and change, these populations in turn shape their environments. However, when I charted the number of learning objectives and their underlying key concepts presented in the course outline, I found this theme to be emphasized the least. Also noteworthy, but not surprising, the course still primarily fixates on governance, power, and politics. Although the theme suggests teaching how humans shape their environments, the course offers little suggestions, if any, for teachers and students to assess our environmental impact. Glaring examples include topics on the environmental consequences of connectivity, world trade, and the Columbian Exchange, which stress the diffusion of new crops for human consumption, the spread of disease, but not the ecological effects of migrating species or monocrop agriculture, for instance. While Alfred Crosby's famous book, The Columbian Exchange, detailed catastrophic effects on the environment and biodiversity, these standards only apply the catastrophe to indigenous people. In topics on the Industrial Revolution, students are expected to explain how environmental factors contributed to industrialization and commodify nature, or recognize its potential as infrastructure. Yet the topic on consequences of industrialization does not include environmental effects. In these topics, nature is commodified as a resource or overcome as an obstacle. There's nothing to suggest degradation or any specific changes to the environment. There is an open invitation to address implications and major changes to environmental process, but these statements are vague and buried. And as a teacher, I received very little environmental history. I need better direction. Modern environmental issues listed in the framework do include deforestation, desertification, and, quote, the release of greenhouse gases and pollutants. But notice this is only as causes for competition for resources, debates about the environment, and debates about the nature and causes of climate change. My perception is that the language here is crafted to avoid any political backlash by allowing the environmental degradation to be debatable. Like many sets of standards for social studies courses in the United States, the AP World History course primarily portrays nature only as a potential asset and environmental consciousness as socio-political activism. Other than listing Greenpeace and Wangari Maathai's Green Belt movement as illustrative examples of calls for reform, the course does not suggest opportunities for recognizing successful patterns of sustainability or the preservation of natural ecology. So I've begun my next project, cataloging content and lessons that reveal the value of sustainable relationships with the natural environment or the potential for collapse in failing to do so. There are ample examples to illustrate degradation and devastation, but there are also hopeful success stories like reforestation of Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate, or the modern replenishment of ozone by restricting chlorofluorocarbons. Perhaps you have some ideas to share too. I know that more environmental history will require less traditional history, but learning and sharing world history has me excited about escaping the gravity of weird biases. I ultimately feel this direction is leading me towards being a better historian, teacher, and ultimately a better ancestor. My article detailing this work can be found on World History Connected, an online journal affiliated with the WHA. It appears within a forum of several articles and an encyclopedia's worth of resources on this topic, ecology and the environment in world history. Thank you so much for joining and hanging out through the final presentation of this session. I'm happy to take your questions and suggestions.